You open your eyes. You're lying on a couch, grapes in hand, surrounded by half-naked senators arguing about oysters. Welcome to ancient Rome, where dinner wasn't a meal. It was a full-contact sport, with vomit breaks. 1. The Feast of Lucullus. You recline in a dining room named after a god, because of course Lucullus named his rooms. Tonight's theme is Apollo, which apparently means lamprey and saffron, peacock glazed with honey, and mullet served so fresh it's still judging you. Slaves drift like stagehands, swapping silver platters the size of shields. The air is thick with garum and cinnamon, an unholy combo your nose files under, luxury with consequences. Lucullus isn't eating dinner. He's conducting an orchestra of excess. You're handed wine cooled with mountain snow, hauled in at ruinous expense. The table blooms with roses, even though it's winter. Someone whispers that this single supper cost more than a small villa. Lucullus smiles when he hears it. He once scolded a steward for serving a cheap meal when no guests were expected, then ordered a spread, worthy of Lucullus dining with Lucullus. The message is simple. Reputation is a course, and you must swallow it. Between the oysters and the boar, you realize the dining room itself changes with seasons to flatter the food. That's not hospitality. That's warfare. By dessert, dates stuffed with nuts and drenched in peppered honey, you're dizzy with sugar, salt, and status. Lucullus raises a cup. You raise a white flag. The adjective Lucullan now lives rent-free in your arteries. 2. Nero's golden banquet. The ceiling moves. No, really. You're in Nero's rotating dining room, the Coenatio Rotunda, slowly spinning while ivory panels sprinkle petals and perfume. The room is a flex, gilded stucco, frescoed gods admiring themselves, and a view of Rome, the size of Nero's ego. Outside, rumors say a city once burned. Inside, the wine is Falernian, and the birds are nightingales stuffed inside quail, because minimalism is for losers. Courses arrive like invading legions. Peacock brains, fig-fed livers, fish arranged by region so the empire can fit on a plate. A poet recites verses about how lucky you are to be alive right now, which is an odd thing to say under a ceiling that can probably collapse on command. Every toast is a performance review. Laugh at the right time. Marvel at the right engineering. Perfume drifts heavier. You're woozy. The room keeps turning, and so does your stomach. A lyre starts up. Someone mentions Nero's latest show, where the emperor sang while others did the dying. You focus on the raisins. Raisins are safe. Are raisins safe? The dessert tray arrives like a peace treaty. Candied nuts, spiced wine jellies, and pine kernels in honey. 3. Cleopatra's pearl dinner. You're not in Rome, but Rome is the headline guest. In Alexandria, Cleopatra eyes Mark Antony across a table that could buy Sicily. She proposes a wager. She can throw a banquet worth a fortune in a single sitting. Then she removes an earring, holding a pearl the size of a guilt trip, drops it into vinegar, and waits. Everyone stares like it's a magic trick. It is. The pearl dissolves enough to chug. She drinks the empire's GDP in one swallow and wins. Pliny will gossip about this for centuries, but all you know is that the room went silent. The menu already screamed, "Don't check the budget." Sea urchins, rare fish, and wine aged since your grandparents were young. But this is different. This is spectacle as policy. Antony laughs too loudly, the way people do when their friend just bought a social network on impulse. Servants bring silver dishes, but they're basically props now. The point has been made. Egypt can outflex Rome at its own game. You sip your cup and imagine accountants crying in Latin. Outside, the harbor grumbles with ships. Inside, Cleopatra smiles like someone who never loses a bet she can rig with chemistry and theater. 4. Caligula's Victory over the ocean. Seafood banquet, wind, salt, and nonsense. After a military farce on the Channel coast, Caligula declares victory over Neptune and orders his men to collect seashells as spoils. Tonight, you dine to celebrate the conquest of the beach. The spread is predictably unhinged. Oysters by the amphora, fish stacked in topographical layers, and octopus tentacles coiled like the emperor's mood. The room is draped in nautical kitsch. Tridents, coral, pearls the size of quail eggs. Caligula glitter bombs the guest list with favors and insults. One moment he's charming. The next he's threatening to promote his horse. The wine is good. The tension is better. You eat quietly because the appetizer could be praise and the dessert could be exile. A general toasts the triumph, and everyone claps like their lives depend on it, which they might. A platter of enormous scallops arrives, each shell engraved with the emperor's titles, subtlety not included. The musicians play sea sound effects. Someone coughs. Everyone hears it. You congratulate the empire on defeating tide pools. 5. Apicius throws money at flavor until it surrenders. Tonight's host is Marcus Gavius. Apicius, patron saint of people who think budget is a slur. The aroma is a thesis statement, garum syrup simmering with dates, pepper, and wine. You taste flamingo, yes, flamingo, its tongue slick with spiced sauce. He calls it interesting texture. You call it a dare. Apicius obsesses over ingredients like they owe him rent. He chases the freshest mullet to the ends of the sea and bullies fishermen with offers they can't refuse. Between courses, he brags that he once sailed to Libya for succulent shrimp, tasted them, and turned back because Rome's were better. The man treats logistics like seasoning. Dishes hit the table in improbable color. Emerald leek purees, glossy pomegranate reductions, rose-scented custards. There's a pig inflated with sausages, so it carves like a charcuterie piñata. You drink honeyed wine through sprigs of rosemary, because straws are for peasants. Somewhere a scribe is taking notes that will outlive everyone here in a cookbook attributed to this very obsession. And yet whispers say, Apicius will die by his own ledger, choosing poison when only a few 100,000 sesterces remain. For him, that's poverty. You lick the last of the peppered honey from your fingers and realize this meal is an investment. In what exactly is unclear. 6. Claudius and the feast that wouldn't end. You arrive at dusk. You leave at still dusk. Time collapses under Claudius's table, the way self-control collapses under his appetite. Platters circle like planets, eel in pepper sauce, boar with dates, and mushrooms so prized they're called the food of the gods. Careful with those. Claudius's life story says, mushrooms giveth and mushrooms taketh away. The emperor eats with the focus of a scholar, and the speed of a man racing a deadline only he can see. Servants swap in fresh cushions when guests sag. You nap between courses, because that's socially acceptable here. Somewhere, a bureaucrat is being promoted while gnawing a chicken bone. Policy and poultry paired. Wine cools in snow. Lamps smoke the ceiling. A courtier tells a joke. Claudius wheezes with laughter. Everyone else laughs at him laughing. There are rumors of feathers and a tickling stick used to make room for more. A grim party hack no one wants to verify firsthand. By the time dessert arrives, poppy seed pastries lacquered in honey. You've forgotten your own name and most of your ethics. 7. Vitellius and the 4 meals a day. Emperor. Vitellius believed moderation was a conspiracy. His daily schedule was a rotation of breakfast feasts, lunch feasts, dinner feasts, and just because feasts. At one point, chroniclers claim he consumed 2,000 fish and 7,000 birds across a single binge, which is less a meal and more an ecological event. His banquets overflowed with rare delicacies, moray eels, flamingo tongues, and sauces thickened with the yolks of exotic eggs. Each dish had to be theatrical, served in gold bowls, garnished with gemstones, and often accompanied by musical interludes. Senators stared into their cups, calculating how much of the treasury had turned into appetizers. The emperor's stomach, according to gossip, was as legendary as his temper. Servants tripped over each other, refilling his goblet with Falernian wine, while poets pretended this was Rome's golden age, rather than a prolonged stomachache. By the end of his reign, even loyalists joked that the empire had been eaten from within. Literally. 8. Domitian's Black Dinner. The invitation was ominous. Guests were told to arrive after dusk, wearing mourning robes. The room they entered was draped entirely in black. Walls, ceiling, furniture, even the food. Domitian, a man obsessed with fear as a tool, had orchestrated a living funeral for his senators. Each guest sat beside a wax effigy of themselves, as music played softly in minor tones. Dinner began in silence. Black bread, black olives, and overcooked meat dyed with squid ink. The emperor spoke only to ask if the guests enjoyed the atmosphere. No one answered. Servants moved like shadows, pouring wine as heavy as blood. Rumors later claimed some men fainted mid-meal. Others believed they would be executed before sunrise. When Domitian finally dismissed them, everyone staggered out into the moonlight alive, but permanently shaken. The emperor's idea of entertainment had been pure psychological warfare, proof that dinner in Rome could be as terrifying as any arena spectacle. 9. Augustus's simple dinner. Augustus liked to present himself as the humble emperor, a man above the vulgar displays of gluttony that ruined lesser nobles. Publicly, he ate coarse bread, cheese, and fruit. Privately, his chefs were engineering new ways to disguise luxury as restraint. A slice of goat cheese might conceal truffle paste. A simple stew could involve imported pheasant broth. His dinners were political theater, moral virtue served on porcelain. Senators dined on meals designed to look austere, but required entire kitchens to prepare. Moderation, for Augustus, was the performance of simplicity without the sacrifice. Every minimal portion sent a message. Rome's ruler was disciplined, rational, and conveniently wealthier than everyone else in the room. To visiting allies, these quiet dinners carried more weight than any banquet of Lucullus or Nero. In a world addicted to extravagance, Augustus made self-control look like the ultimate luxury good. 10. The Saturnalia Feast. Once a year, Rome turned upside down. Slaves dined with masters, gambling replaced work, and tables collapsed under mountains of roast meats. Saturnalia was chaos ritualized, an explosion of freedom before the long Roman winter. You could insult your boss, wear your toga backward, and toast to equality you didn't actually have. Food was abundant and deliberately excessive. Whole pigs roasted on spits, sausages floated in wine, and honey cakes vanished faster than reason. Servants were served first. Masters poured their drinks. Philosophers called it moral decay. Everyone else called it Tuesday. The laughter, drinking, and music spilled into streets until the city pulsed like one massive tavern. The idea wasn't indulgence for indulgence's sake. It was a pressure valve for a rigid society. Tomorrow, the hierarchy would return. Tonight, Rome reminded itself that even empires need to misbehave to survive. 11. Marcus Aurelius' Stoic Supper. When Marcus Aurelius hosted a dinner, guests braced for disappointment. The philosopher-emperor preferred boiled vegetables, dry bread, and water. An ascetic diet meant to prove that virtue could survive the aroma of roasted boar next door. Conversations centered on ethics, mortality, and the futility of dessert. Senators endured it politely. unsure whether this was moral instruction or punishment. The emperor would quote Epictetus while chewing barley cakes that even the slaves found depressing. Yet the atmosphere carried a strange dignity. In a world of gilded gluttons, Marcus was making a point. Mastery of the self was the truest form of luxury. By the end, guests left not stuffed but unsettled, as though they'd been lectured by a moral accountant. The only indulgence permitted was philosophy, and maybe a second fig if you'd shown good character. 12. Tiberius's Cave of Delights. Capri's cliffs hide a palace that hums with scandal. Tiberius's Cave of Delights was part dining hall, part myth, part warning. Inside, candlelight flickered over mosaics of Dionysus and rivers of wine. Musicians played while acrobats and dancers blurred the line between entertainment and indulgence. Guests reclined beside fountains perfumed with myrrh. The courses were endless: oysters, honeyed dormice, and venison glazed in spice. The emperor watched from behind gauzy curtains, appearing only when the mood or the gossip pleased him. Ancient writers describe the scene with disgust, but also envy. Outside, the empire whispered that Tiberius had turned his exile into Olympus. Inside, the wine flowed like policy, and reality melted into luxury. Capri became the symbol of what absolute power does when it grows bored of governing and starts seasoning pleasure like a roast. 13. The wedding feast of Pompey and Julia politics never tasted so sweet or so doomed. When Pompey the Great married Julia, daughter of Julius Caesar, the celebration stretched across Rome. 6,000 guests reclined beneath silk canopies, while musicians, jugglers, and dancers wove through tables heavy with peacock, venison, and gilded pastries. Wine from Falernum ran like a river. Senators toasted alliances they secretly hated. Caesar grinned. Pompey pretended this wasn't a merger disguised as romance, and everyone tried not to mention the civil war that clearly had dessert reservations. By midnight, rose petals covered the marble floors. Slaves staggered under trays of figs and honey. And Rome whispered about what power really looked like. Two families pretending to love each other until the empire broke in half. The feast was magnificent. The marriage, not so much. And speaking of marriages between appetite and ambition, if you're halfway through this chaos and still watching, consider joining Ancient Absurdity. Subscribe so you don't miss history's next disastrous dinner party. It's cheaper than Lucullus's leftovers and slightly more educational. 14. The Triumph Banquet of Julius Caesar. After conquering Gaul, Caesar returned to Rome with a problem. Too many captives, too much gold, and not enough humility. His solution was simple: feed everyone. Over 260,000 citizens were invited to a citywide feast featuring entire herds roasted in public squares. Bread was hurled from balconies like political confetti. The spectacle worked. Caesar's enemies muttered about dictatorship, but his popularity soared with every loaf and skewer. Food was propaganda that tasted like victory. Citizens cheered his generosity, conveniently forgetting whose taxes had seasoned the roast. When night fell, torches illuminated miles of tables. The emperor raised a cup, toasting Rome's destiny. A poet nearby whispered that this banquet would feed rebellion someday too. He was right. 15. The Feast of Lepidus. Marcus Lepidus, one of Caesar's lesser-known allies, tried to outdo everyone by staging a dinner that resembled an arms race in calories. His table glittered with gold plates, flamingo tongues, and entire ostriches roasted whole. Wine arrived in crystal amphorae, carried by boys dressed as cupids. Subtlety was not the theme. Each guest received a silver model of the dish they ate, to keep as a souvenir and a reminder of how much poorer they were than Lepidus. The floor was strewn with flower petals, the ceiling with mirrors reflecting more excess back onto itself. It was the kind of night that made even Lucullus roll his eyes from beyond the grave. By dawn, guests were asleep on couches, the slaves were still serving, and Rome had one more cautionary tale about trying too hard to look important. 16. The Banquet of Messalina. In the palace of Claudius, Empress Messalina turned dinner into theatre. Her private banquets blurred into nightly carnivals of luxury and scandal. Senators' wives reclined beside gladiators. Poets recited verses that no one would dare to publish. Food arrived in waves: pheasant, oysters, and pastries, molded into suggestive shapes that made even Nero blush. Messalina's parties weren't mere indulgence. They were politics by appetite. Invitations meant access. Absences meant exile. Behind the laughter and perfume, alliances shifted like dice on a gaming table. For Rome, gossip was currency, and Messalina minted it in gold leaf and scandal. When her downfall came, historians wrote more about her dinners than her death. In Rome, a feast could immortalize you faster than any monument. 17. The Pisonian Conspiracy Dinner. A dinner table can be a battlefield. In 65 CE, senators and officers gathered under the pretense of celebration, but were secretly plotting to assassinate Nero. The wine flowed, the plans didn't. As courses arrived, roasted hare, figs, and salted mullet, so did hesitation. Someone lost nerve, someone whispered too loudly. Within days, the emperor's spies uncovered everything. Most conspirators died before finishing their next meal. That night's menu entered history, not for flavor, but for failure. In Rome, you could die for your beliefs, or your dinner conversation. 18. Hadrian's Villa Banquets. At Tivoli, Emperor Hadrian built a villa so vast it contained replicas of Egypt, Greece, and the underworld. His dinners moved through them like a culinary grand tour. Guests might start in Athens, eating lamb with honeyed figs, then float across a man-made canal to Alexandria for spiced fish and lotus wine. Each meal was part anthropology, part ego project. Slaves in regional costumes served from marble kitchens. Philosophers debated aesthetics between courses. When Hadrian's lover Antinous died, even grief became a feast. Statues raised, incense burned, and black-robed diners toasted memory with pomegranate wine. To dine with Hadrian was to travel the empire without leaving the table. Geography became gastronomy, and power, once again, tasted imported. 19. The dinner of Crispinus the Fishmonger. Juvenal immortalized Crispinus, a freedman who rose from selling fish to dining like a senator. His infamous banquet began with mullets large enough to warrant a census. The air shimmered with perfume and arrogance. Every dish screamed new money: parrotfish in saffron sauce, oysters from Baiae, and wine older than his social class. Guests whispered about the irony of a fishmonger drowning in luxury. Crispinus didn't care. He had escaped the smell of the market, only to surround himself with it in refined form. The meal was a manifesto of insecurity, a declaration that wealth could rewrite identity, even if it couldn't buy taste. By dessert, the triclinium glittered with spilled pearls and self-congratulation. The empire's satire writers would dine on this man's reputation for centuries longer than any of his guests ate his fish. 20. Heliogabalus's Rose Petal Massacre. Emperor Heliogabalus was barely old enough to vote, but already old enough to weaponize flowers. At one feast, guests reclined beneath a retractable ceiling rigged with baskets of rose petals. The mechanism jammed. Too many petals fell. Several diners suffocated before dessert. To the emperor, it was art. To everyone else, it was an object lesson in why the gods invented ventilation. The rest of the evening continued as if nothing had happened, Music, peacock dishes, fountains of perfume. Historians later treated the event as metaphor, Rome literally drowning in its own decadence. It was luxury turned lethal, the final evolution of spectacle into absurdity. The next time someone says, "It's just dinner," remember this roomful of guests buried alive in roses. 21. Commodus's gladiator banquet. The son of Marcus Aurelius traded philosophy for theatre. Commodus hosted banquets inside the arena itself, serving noble guests, while condemned men fought a few meters away. Between courses, he personally entered the sand to perform mock combats, demanding applause like a drunken actor. Food mixed with blood and sand. Dishes arrived shaped like the weapons outside. Boar spears as skewers, helmets filled with fruit. Senators smiled through gritted teeth, terrified of displeasing the emperor who treated the empire as dinner entertainment. When he raised a goblet and toasted himself as Hercules, reborn, no one dared contradict him. They clinked glasses and swallowed their fear. For some, it would be their last toast. 22. Severus Alexander's intellectual feast. Amid the chaos of Rome's 3rd century, Severus Alexander tried to revive civility. His dinners were salons disguised as banquets, scrolls on the table, philosophers at every couch, and dishes arranged like arguments, structured, deliberate, overlong. 600 courses cycled through themes of empire and virtue. Between bites of roasted fowl, discussions ranged from Stoic ethics to urban plumbing. The emperor believed conversation was seasoning. He was partly right. It also cooled the food. Still, the effort mattered. In a century devouring itself, Alexander's dinners suggested that reason could share a plate with indulgence. Civilization, he seemed to argue, isn't lost in an instant. It just gets distracted by the next course. 23. Aurelian's victory feast. After defeating Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, Aurelian returned to Rome determined to throw a celebration loud enough to erase memory of civil war. The triumph stretched for 3 days, the feast for nearly as long. Bread, pork, and wine were distributed to the crowds, while nobles reclined on cushions embroidered with the word, "restored." Zenobia herself was paraded through the streets in golden chains, a living centerpiece for the empire's appetite. When night fell, Aurelian dined in the Temple of the Sun, thanking the gods for empire and stamina. His message was clear: unity tastes better than rebellion, even if both are hard to digest. 24. Diocletian's retirement feast. In a rare act of voluntary abdication, Diocletian stepped down from power and retreated to his palace at Split. His farewell dinner surprised everyone. It was grand but strangely peaceful. Instead of power plays, there were vegetables from his own gardens, fish from the Adriatic, and a quiet dignity that Rome barely remembered. He raised a cup to the empire and announced he preferred cabbage to conspiracy. Guests laughed awkwardly, unsure if it was a joke. It wasn't. Diocletian spent the rest of his life cultivating literal produce, while his successors cultivated disaster. In a civilization addicted to spectacle, his simple banquet was the only true act of rebellion left. 25. The last imperial banquet of Romulus Augustulus. The Western Empire was collapsing, and its final emperor, a teenager, presided over a dinner that felt more like a wake. The hall was dim, the food modest, boar stew, coarse bread, and the kind of wine that tasted like regret. The courtiers still toasted Rome eternal, but even the echoes sounded tired. Odoacer's army approached while the candles burned low. Servants whispered about flight. Musicians played anyway. The empire that had once dined on the world now couldn't afford its own myth. When morning came, Romulus surrendered his crown without a fight. The feast was over, the dishes cold, and history quietly pushed back its chair. Rome's banquets began as celebrations of empire and ended as autopsies of it. From Lucullus's gilded gluttony to a boy emperor's final meal, every course told the same story. Power always eats itself last.